bear with me for a second while I do that. There we are. So Jim, if you just remind me when you want me to move the slides on, I will do that. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I'm delighted to be kicking off this inaugural series of seminars through the medium of this amazing technology. I really hope it's working, and I hope everybody can hear me. I think I have everything set up here. So on the assumption that everybody can hear what I'm saying, I'll start. I came across the phrases peculiar theories and peculiar views during my research. And these phrases were used by friends of James Fintan Lalor, who found his ideas about how the land should be managed a little odd or strange. Who owned the land, how it was held and by whom, and who should benefit from it. These were the main themes that preoccupied Lalor towards the end of his life. When you examine his broad doctrine of landholding and nationhood, you find that within it are a number of distinct, peculiar theories. And today I would like to discuss two of these in some detail. But before I do, I'd like to sketch out his overall position on the Irish land question. And perhaps we can move to the next slide, Peter. Now, the conventional wisdom about land at that time has been summed up by the historian Roy Douglas. And this is what he had to say in his book, Land, People and Politics. Land, in the eyes of most people, was a species of property essentially like other property, and all property rights were quite literally sacred, for a violation of property rights was an infringement of the commandment not to steal. That's the quote from Roy Douglas. Now, Lauder would have agreed that this was the widely held belief among landowners in Ireland, but he deplored the consequences for the people who actually worked the land, especially following the arrival of potato blight. In a letter to the Tipperary Vindicator, published in July 1847, he wrote, "The potato failed last year. The landlord took the corn, the tenant famished. In the parish I reside in, several families paid up their rents to the last penny at November and died of hunger during the winter." When James Fintan Lauder considers the horrors afflicting the country, he came to a radical conclusion. It is time, he wrote, to see it is God's will that society should stand dissolved and assume another shape and action. To the past we can never return, even if we would. So what was his solution, his plan for a fresh start? Nothing less than a root and branch reform of society that would transform Ireland and make her a beacon for other nations. In his words, Ireland would come to be seen as the lodestar of history. Lauder proposed that two previously separate aspirations be linked together, like a railway carriage to the engine. In short, Lauder believed that in order for Ireland to become a sovereign nation, it was not enough to gain political independence from Britain. The land itself had to be under the control of the people. If this were achieved, the impact would reach far beyond Ireland's shores. As he wrote in 1848, "The right of the people to make the laws, this produced the first great modern earthquake, whose latest shocks even now are heaving the heart of the world. The right of the people to own the land, this will produce the next." In other words, if Lauder's plan succeeded in Ireland, the international impact would be as significant as that of the French Revolution. The problem was that virtually everyone with whom he shared his thinking about the land question found his position incomprehensible. hence the phrase peculiar theories. In my research, I found only a handful of other writers and thinkers from the period who shared Lalor's radical perspective on the issue of landholding. One was James Bronte O'Brien from Longford, a little older than Lalor. He became a leading member of the Chartist movement in England. Another was Thomas Spence, a Newcastle-born radical journalist and contemporary of Tom Paine. Both O'Brien and Spence opposed what might be called the privatisation of land. That is, the expropriation by a few of the soil on which all depended for life itself. In Britain, this manifested itself in the enclosure by private individuals of land held in common by the people. The same process happened in Ireland too, but far worse from Lalor's perspective was what he referred to as the English garrison of landlords, who represented British power and who controlled the fortunes of millions of tenant farmers and smallholders. But if Lauder found that few of his contemporaries shared his radical perspective, succeeding generations of Irish activists and politicians were inspired by what they read in his published writings. People like Michael Davitt, Patrick Pearse, Eamon de Valera, and Raymond Crotty invoked and promoted the teachings and philosophy of James Fintan Lalor. As Pearse wrote in his last essay, The Sovereign People, no one who wrote as little as Lalor has ever written so well. But Lalor's legacy is not based simply on the quality of his writing. It's his ideas that we are concerned about today. Now, we don't have time this afternoon to delve into the fine detail of Lalor's plan, but I would like to take you through two elements of his teachings, or if you like, two of his peculiar theories. The first of these is the concept of implied assent. Now, we are probably all familiar with this concept, and I'd say many of us have first-hand experience. I know I have. It's when someone decides to invade your space in some way without your express permission. So, unless you object straight away, they will take your silence as implied assent and carry on. A good example I'm familiar with is junk mail. Unless you stick a sign on your front door or your letterbox saying no junk mail, keep getting leaflets and flyers offering you pizza deliveries or telling you how much you could sell your house for. These people will never ask you up front if they may stuff your letterbox with their ads. They'll just keep doing it until you say no. I'm sure we all have our own examples, some more serious than others. But back in the 1840s, James Fintan Lalor wasn't worried about junk mail. He was deeply concerned about the land question. In Ireland, land was seen as an asset for the few rather than as a resource for the many. Lalor saw this state of affairs as a direct consequence of British rule. Britain had introduced into the country a form of land tenure that equated property with power, and land was the only property worth having. So we move on to the next slide, Peter, please. Lalor found a legal textbook in his father's library. It was the 4-volume Commentaries on the Laws of England by William Blackstone. And here's a statue of him, which I think is in one of the colleges in Oxford. In the second volume of the Commentaries, he read Blackstone's analysis of the historical grounds for owning property in land. In particular, this passage on what Blackstone called the Rite of Occupancy. And this is what Blackstone wrote in that book. The right of occupancy is founded on a tacit and implied assent of all mankind that the first occupant should become the owner. Now this infuriated James Fintan Lauder. He rejected Blackstone's first come, first served notion, where no permission was sought or granted before the land was taken. This, he maintained, would be nothing more or better than the right of the robber who holds forcible possession of what does not lawfully belong to him. Thomas Horne, in his study of British political thought from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, had this to say about the consequences of this model of landholding. As landed property fell into the hands of private individuals and families, the revenues produced by the land were used less to maintain the people than to buy luxuries for the rich. Lalor rejected implied assent in favour of what he called common agreement. He spelt out what he meant by this. No man can legitimately claim possession or occupation of any portion of land or any right of property therein, except by grant from the people, at the will of the people, as tenant to the people, and on terms and conditions made or sanctioned by the people. However, in the case of Ireland, Lauder objected to the fact that Britain had not only conquered Ireland militarily and politically, it had also taken control of the land, and the Irish were reduced to being nothing more than tenants in their own country. Although Lauder was as appalled as anyone at the devastation caused by the famine, he also saw in this catastrophe an opportunity for Ireland to begin anew, to cast off the form of land tenure imposed by Britain. As he wrote in 1848, "I was biding my time when the potato failure hurried a crisis. The landlords and English government took instant advantage of the famine, and the small occupiers began to quit in thousands. I saw that Ireland was to be won at once or lost forever." So, Peter, the next slide, please. Now, that quotation is taken from a newspaper article published in 1848 under the banner "The Faith of a Felon." And this banner you see on the screen is the newspaper in which it appeared. The briefly alive The Irish Felon, which it says is a successor to the United Irishman, which was a paper run by John Mitchell before he was sent off to Tasmania or Australia, I can't remember which. So even though it is unfinished, The Faith of a Felon, the article which Lalor authored, contains the most complete and unbridled exposition of his thinking on the land question. In it, he explained why he rejected Blackstone's implied assent. And this is what he wrote. The earth, together with The earth, together with all it spontaneously produces, is the free and common property of all mankind, of natural right and by the grant of God. And, all men being equal, no man, therefore, has a right to appropriate exclusively to himself any part or portion thereof, except with the common consent and agreement of all other men. Common consent and agreement were necessary because the people were, as Lauder had already stated in a letter to John Mitchell, first proprietors and lords paramount. Also, in The Faith of a Felon, Lauder wrote that in a self-governing, fully independent nation, the people should decide in national congress or convention what rents they are to pay and to whom they are to pay them. He then made his own position clear in the following statement from the same article. And that the people, on grounds of policy and economy, ought to decide as a general rule, admitting of reservations, that those rents shall be paid to themselves, the people, for public purposes, and for behoof and benefit of them, the entire general people. Now, Lauder's stance, as stated in that quotation, was remarkably similar to that of another radical thinker, Karl Marx. In his manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx proposed, and this is a quotation, the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Now, this brings me to the second of Lalor's peculiar theories I'd like to discuss today. And this is his use of what I called the Queen metaphor. The first thing to say is that despite his anti-conquest rhetoric, James Fintan Lalor was by no means an Anglophobe. He loved English literature and read John Milton's poetry and Walter Scott's novels. But it wasn't only England's culture that he admired. Britain had introduced into Ireland the feudal concept of the monarch as Lord Paramount, or effective owner of all the land in his kingdom. The king could grant land to his loyal supporters for as long as they paid allegiance to him. This allegiance was formalized in a Christian ceremony in which a supporter or vassal paid homage to his lord or king, and then took a solemn oath of fealty to defend and protect his lord with honour and chivalry. This created a personal bond between the two men. As long as he fulfilled his oath, the vassal was allowed to use the land granted to him by his lord. While Lauder liked this concept, he didn't like the idea of the Irish being subject to the British Crown. He preferred allegiance to Ireland as the criterion for holding land. Lawler's adaptation of the feudal code meant that even the hated landlords could hold onto their land if they pledged allegiance to Ireland. This would apply whether or not they regarded themselves as Irish or British. Addressing the landlords directly, he wrote, "Allegiance to this fair island, it is your title of tenure to the lands you hold, and in right of it you hold them." He then went on, "Forever henceforth the owners of our soil must be Irish." But what did he mean by Irish? He explained in the next sentence, "To all who own land or living in Ireland, Ireland henceforth must be the Queen Island." In Lawler's mind, Irishness was not simply a matter of owning land or being resident in the country. In his use of expressions such as Fair Island and Queen Island, Lawler was hinting at what he meant by allegiance to Ireland. He wasn't referring merely to a small island on the edge of northern Europe. How could anyone be expected to pledge their allegiance to a piece of land or a sandbank, in Thomas Davis's memorable phrase? Lauder felt that even the concept of nation would not arouse the depth of commitment he envisaged. No, Lauder was talking about something quite different. So the next slide, please, Peter. In Ireland at the time, Unionists and Nationalists alike regarded the young Queen Victoria as the official Queen of Ireland. And here you can see her on, I think, her first trip to Ireland with Prince Albert. Whatever about Unionists, Lauder was concerned that nationalists were prepared to acknowledge the British Crown's authority over them. For example, at a meeting of Daniel O'Connell's Repeal Association near Abbeyleix in 1843, The first resolution, proposed and passed with unbounded acclamation, was an expression of Ireland's devotional allegiance to our beloved sovereign, that is, the British monarch. The speaker who followed O'Connell onto the platform, a land activist named William Connor, claimed that no true Irishman would change our loved Victoria for all the stern Republicans in Europe. At a banquet later that same evening, attended by Daniel O'Connell, the first toast was raised to the health of the Queen, to which the Assembly responded with cries of "God save the Queen." Likewise, the Young Irelanders supported the British monarchy. One of their leaders, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, cited the Crown of Ireland Act of 1542 to claim that Queen Victoria now reigns over Ireland. This sentiment was echoed even by the radical supporters of John Mitchell. The editor of the Irish Felon, John Martin, wrote that "I owe no allegiance except to Ireland and to the English Queen as Queen of Ireland." Another Mitchell supporter, Michael Doheny, was equally firm that "no one questions Her Majesty's claim to the Crown of Ireland." Well, James Fintan Lauder did, and he wanted to replace the widespread attachment to the British Crown with a different focus for nationalist allegiance. Next slide, please, Peter. In both his private communications with Young Ireland and his published articles in the press, Lalor repeatedly invoked the Queen metaphor. The earliest surviving example can be found in his letter to Thomas D'Arcy McGee. In driving home to McGee his point that landed property should become subject to the will of the Irish people, Lauder used a striking image. "I would make Ireland, in fact, as she is in right, mistress and queen of all those lands, that she is a lady of soft heart and grateful disposition, and may, in reward of allegiance, confer new titles or confirm the old." 2 months later, he employed the same sort of language in a letter to John Mitchell, adding the warning that those landlords who refused to swear allegiance to this island queen should cease to be landowners or quit this land. Lauder did not confine references to the Queen to his private correspondence. In his first article for the Nation newspaper, he reminded landowners that Ireland was their own mother country. In his attempt to persuade them to rethink their traditional loyalties, Lauder urged the landlords to regard the Queen Island as their rightful sovereign. He offered them the prospect of becoming latter-day chivalric knights who would, in his words, carry her banner in battle. In his newspaper articles, he depicted Ireland as a poor lady who had been decrowned and who must be restored to her rightful position, with an armed hand if necessary. "Let us crown her a queen," Lalor demanded, "and then let her do with her lands as a queen." Lalor's use of the queen metaphor has never been examined in any of the academic studies of Lalor's life. Who was this queen who had been driven from her throne, and why should anyone pledge their allegiance to her? As a well-read man, Lalor is probably familiar with a long tradition in Irish literature of personifying the nation as a woman. For instance, Gaelic poets of the early 17th century often portrayed Ireland as a female ravaged by a predatory neighbour. Other writers drew on pre-Christian mythology to depict the feminine Ireland in a stronger light before the conquest by Britain. An example can be found in a popular book of the time called The Spirit of the Nation. Among the many ballads and verses to be found in that book was one entitled Western War Song. These lines from that poem are similar, I think, to Lalor's sentiments about his island queen. From the rock-guarded mountains, her cradle and throne, she moves in her splendor, she moves not alone. For myriads unsheathing the chain-breaking sword, now hail the bright vision, long vainly adored. In Lalor's own time, the poems of James Clarence Mangan, such as Dark Rosaleen, were published in the Nation newspaper. The following lines are taken from another of Mangan's poems entitled A Cry for Ireland, which the Nation published in May 1846. Grief of all griefs is to see how thy throne is usurped, whilst thyself art in thrall. But who was this dethroned queen that Lalor and these poets were referring to? To find the answer, we must go back to the ancient history and the mythology of pre-Norman Ireland. I found this in one of the books on the subject I came across. This is Conan Kennedy's Ancient Ireland, the User's Guide. And it says, Ireland itself takes its Irish language name from Éire, a goddess of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Origins are as Éireann, queen of the Dé Danann, daughter of Fiachna. Éireann was slain by Sergia the Milesian at the Battle of Teltown in 1698 BC. According to the Irish scholar T.F. O'Reilly, writing in the 1940s, Éireann was honoured as the Earth Mother, who was identified with the land of Ireland. In the article, O'Reilly went on to state, in early Irish belief, each king of Tara or Ireland, on attaining the kingship, was espoused to the goddess Éireann. In one poem, we find her depicted as a lady wearing a golden crown and seated on a crystal throne, having before her a vat of red liquor, from which she pours a draught into a gold cup, which she hands to each successive king of Ireland. The idea of Ireland as a woman, wedded to her rightful king, persisted all through the centuries, but then, owing to the English invasion, Éire has long been widowed. And that was O'Reilly from the article about Éireann. So here we have a female and a queen who is first human and then divine. Through her marriage to the king, she provides him with the power to rule the land, but following the Norman invasion, she was widowed, effectively dethroned. In his use of the queen metaphor, James Fintan Lauder may have been trying to counteract the widespread support in Ireland for a queen who was not herself Irish at all. And he did so by tapping into something deep in Irish consciousness that resonated with him and perhaps also with his audience. If we accept that Lalor's audience encompasses not just his contemporaries, but also his later admirers, whom I mentioned earlier, then perhaps we can find traces of the queen metaphor in their writings. So the next slide, please, Peter. For instance, Patrick Pearse, whom we see here, revered James Fintan Lalor as one of the four ghosts of Irish nationalism, whose writings inspired him. Pearse described Lalor as a fiery spirit, some angelic missionary with a great spiritual strength and gifted with a mind which had the trenchant beauty of steel. In an article arguing for Lalor's influence on Pearse, the author highlighted the resemblance between Lalor's final published letter, Clearing Decks, and Pearse's 1913 essay, The Coming Revolution. Pearse's writing in this piece reflects Lalor's emphasis in that article, Clearing Decks, on blood sacrifice. But more broadly, the two men shared a common perception of the nation. As Pearse put it in his article, whatever comes to Ireland, she needs men. And this short sentence brings to my mind Lalor's queen metaphor, in particular his appeal to the chivalric impulse of his readership, I mentioned earlier. Pearse more obviously invoked the personification of Ireland as a feminine presence in his Irish language poem Misha Era. In translation it begins, I am Ireland, I am older than the hag of Bera. So we move on to the next slide, and that features Eamon de Valera, who was another devotee of James Fintan Lauder. Next slide, please, Peter. Thomas O'Neill, who wrote biographies of both de Valera and Lauder, argued that Dev based his position in the Anglo-Irish negotiations of 1921 on Lauder's principle of equality between Britain and Ireland. In 1925, during a speech he gave at Bodenstown, de Valera invoked James Fintan Lauder, just as Pearse had done, as an exemplar of republican ideals for Ireland. When de Valera became president of the Executive Council in 1932, he identified the nationalist aims of his new government with the principles put forward by Lalor. In 1935, when he was drafting the content of the proposed new constitution, de Valera decided that the name of the state shall be Eire. And that simple statement stuck right through to the referendum of 1937, when the constitution was adopted by the people and is still there today. De Valera's choice of name was controversial. This was not because of a concern that a reminder of the country's pagan past would be enshrined in an otherwise Christian document. It was more to do with the possibility of confusion arising internationally about the adoption of an unaccustomed name for the country. In the Dáil debate on his draft constitution, Dev never mentioned Lalor. Instead, he defended his choice of name as logical and suggested that it would represent a small advance for the Irish language. Although, as I have said, Lalor's impact on these men is clear, I can find no direct evidence that Lalor's invocation of the island queen influenced the references to Eire by his later admirers. If there was any influence, it was probably subliminal, or perhaps all three drew upon an ancient tradition that had persisted for centuries and is now largely ignored or forgotten. So finally, I'd like to touch on a problem for students of James Fintan Lauder. The documentary sources are so incomplete that we are often compelled to move from a solid foundation of historical record to the realms of speculative inquiry. This leads to all sorts of assumptions and conjectures about Lalor the man and Lauder the theoretician. For instance, he has been depicted as a tall, commanding figure when in reality he was very short and suffered from curvature of the spine. A post-independence brand of republicanism would have us believe that Lalor was a Gael Gore, known as Seamus Fintan I Lalor, if I pronounced that correctly. In fact, Lalor, as we've seen, loved English literature, and there is no evidence that he had any interest or proficiency in the Irish language. To some, he was a proto-socialist who advocated land nationalisation. To others, his writings prefigured the advent, in Philip Bull's phrase, the small capitalist peasant proprietors who began to assume ownership of the land later in the 19th century. Is Lalor an irrelevance today, a relic of a male-dominated world where women were placed on a pedestal to be worshipped, but never allowed to have any practical say in the running of society? Or should we regard him as a particularly insightful thinker, aware of an unchanging quality in Irish nationhood that is central to the health and well-being of the people, what Pearse called the national soul? My own view is that James Fintan Lauder combined both the material and the spiritual in his approach to Ireland, like an amalgam of, say, Sean Lamass and Sean O'Riordan. Someone who wanted to alleviate the practical problems of his day while also imagining a new Ireland that would be true to its own unique legacy. Lauder does not fit into any historical pigeonhole, whether it be centred on the land question, the Young Ireland movement, or 19th century Irish nationalism in general. He is an outlier and should, I believe, be studied on his own terms, without any presumptions. That is what I have tried to do in my research. Whether or not I have succeeded, I will leave to others. But for the moment, thank you very much.
James, thank you very much for that very erudite and clearly delivered paper. I'm sure it will generate a number of questions. So let me open it up. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please press the little hand icon at the top of your screen, and I'll come to you and then just unmute your microphone and ask the question. So who'd like to start? James. You need to unmute your microphone. Can't hear you, James. You need to unmute your microphone. Can you hear me? No, we can't hear you, I'm afraid. There you are.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Sorry, it's misbehaving this Monday afternoon. Thanks very much, James. I'm just get right to the crux of it, really, as you were kind of addressing it there towards the end. You know, in which way should he be read? Do you think is it that he was a proto-Marxist and advocating common ownership of the land, or is it that he's prefiguring the kind of small capitalist proprietor that we see emerging in Bernard Shaw's John Bull's Other Island, for example, one obviously far more radical than the other. And he is such an eloquent writer and so articulate that, and I know, the great weight of what writings we have of his would suggest the former, that it's common ownership, but then you look at his letter in the Irish Felon, and towards the end he's saying there's no one has greater respect for a rightful understanding of property ownership than I. So like, you can't really have it both ways, and it's surprising that there would be any ambiguity there on such a central issue. Where would you come down on it, or how would you kind of defend one or the other position?
Well, it's a very good question, and that was one of the things that spurred me into trying to answer it, because there is a lot of ambiguity in the historiography, the academic analysis of Lalor, insofar as there is such a thing. I would say that most commentators tend to fall down on the conservative side of the argument, which is that he essentially was a prophet of what became the transfer of land later in the 19th century, early 20th century, from the landlords to the small peasants, and that he was essentially advocating some kind of peasant proprietary. Now, there are a few dissenters whom I also came across, but I wanted to see, could I read his stuff and figure out for myself what exactly he meant? So that's the purpose of my book, and it's not an easy question to answer in a few sentences. Because it required a great deal of, I suppose you would call it, close reading of the text. But the conclusion I came to is that he was indeed what you would call an early advocate of land nationalisation. And in that sense, he was quite close in his thinking to the people I mentioned, Bronte O'Brien and Thomas Spence, and indeed Karl Marx. Now, I found no evidence that he had any contact with any of those people, or even was aware of some of them, and certainly that he never read any of their stuff if it predated his own. So I can find no trace of influence, but there is certainly a very close similarity between all their positions on the land question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Let's go to Sean.
Sorry, I'm just unmuting myself. That was a fascinating paper. One of the big things that's hard to understand with Lauder is the contrast between him and the other members of his family. I mean, his father is a Liberal MP, and his brother, Peter Lauder, goes to Australia, where he's a leader initially of the Eureka Stockade revolt. But later, when he's a member of Parliament in Victoria, he makes himself quite unpopular with his constituents because he resists a campaign to open up the lands. Miners who made a bit of money, gold miners who made a bit of money, want to be able to buy small plots of land. And Lauder is saying, no, it's not in the interest of Victoria to break up agricultural land into small patches. You know, we need decent sized holdings and profitable commercial agriculture. So there's a real contrast there between those two siblings. They both have initially very radical impulses. Peter Lauder becomes a very different figure later. So what makes Fintan Lauder so different from his father and brother?
Yeah, it's another very interesting question. And again, it's something that I wanted to explore in my research. And I did try to understand the family dynamic. I'm not by any means suggesting some kind of psychological analysis of the interpersonal relationships, but there were certainly differences between Lauder and the rest of them, including his father, his brother Richard in particular. Now, his younger brother Richard, who, as you say, became an MP and lived much longer than his older brother, was a supporter of Fintan Lauder in that period, 1847, 1848. But Fintan Lauder, who was the eldest son in a large family, was, I think, and this is not an historical term, was, I think, a black sheep in the sense that he had a very strong antipathy or difficulty, let's put it like that, with his father that persisted right through, as far as I can see, the public record anyway, and that's a matter of maybe 5 or 6 years. The evidence for this is the fact that Fintan Lauder was buried in an unmarked grave in Glasnevin Cemetery. And I've been down to County Laois to visit the family home, and the pretty fine little cemetery in the land where both Pat Lauder, the father, and Richard Lauder, the son, and maybe other members of the family are buried. And the contrast is quite startling. And I think the fact that this is the way Fintan Lauder ended up. He died essentially alone in a garret in Dublin, and was buried, as I say, in an unmarked grave in Glasnevin, and remains there to this day, is perhaps an indication of the rift that was never healed. But this is probably territory I'm not qualified to comment on, other than to say the evidence supports the fact that there was a rift, and there is other evidence to suggest that Lalor and his father never really saw eye to eye on personal matters and issues to do with land, Daniel O'Connell, repeal versus total separation, all those issues. And I'll have to leave it to other people maybe to explain why that was the case.
Okay, Jim, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Anyone have a point they'd like to make or a question to raise? Just Robin.
Hi, Jim. Thanks, I really enjoyed that.
Robin, how are you doing?
Not too bad. You mentioned at the top that he had an influence on Raymond Crotty. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, it was through Raymond Crotty that I first heard of James Fintan Lauder. And Raymond Crotty didn't say a great deal about Lauder. He did invoke him in some of his books as a kind of totem for his own belief in the wisdom of land nationalization, which he advocated along with other radical economic reforms in his various books. So I can't really say very much other than anybody that I've come across who admired Lauder, like Pierce, De Valera, Davitt, James Connolly, they tended to say very little by way of commentary about why they admired him, other than to simply quote large chunks of Lawler's own writings in support of their point of view. And it's almost as if they felt ill-equipped to paraphrase or distill Lawler's philosophy into their own words. And I think Crotty was the same. As far as Crotty was concerned, Lauder was a very early, if not the first, in these islands, advocate of something that he believed in passionately, which was radical economic reform, essentially based around some form of public ownership or public taxation of the land, such as was advocated by Henry George later on.
Mhm.
So I can't really answer the question, but the evidence is there if you care to read Crotty's stuff.
Okay, that's right. Thanks very much.
Good, thanks. Other questions? Anybody else? Okay, I might ask one then. So, Jim, Lawler's obviously not simply satisfied with articulating ideas and communicating them on paper. He feels called to, to get involved in face-to-face agitation, but not very successfully. Obviously, it's difficult to describe his involvement with the Holy Cross meeting, the attempt to set up a land agitation in County Tipperary in 1847 at Holy Cross is anything other than a bit of a fiasco, which ends in a kind of fist fight and the stage collapsing under himself and William Connor. So, can you reflect perhaps maybe on the relationship between Lalor the thinker and Lalor the activist, and perhaps why he isn't able to take his innovative ideas successfully into the public domain in his own lifetime?
Well, again, a very interesting question, Peter, and one for which I'm not terribly well equipped, because it requires me to kind of understand why someone who thinks great thoughts is unable, apparently, to put them into action, or indeed to inspire other people, his contemporaries, to join him in that. And the Holy Cross debacle is a good example, where he single-handedly tried to create a movement in Tipperary, but he knew he needed help from his erstwhile Young Ireland colleagues, most of whom were indifferent or even opposed to what he was trying to do. So that was one example. Another example is the so-called 1849 failed rising, which he tried to get going, which was an even greater fiasco than the one in 1848 in Ballingarry. So Lauder the actor and Lauder the activist, if purely judged on those events, is a total failure. But Lauder the thinker and Lauder the writer is the person, I think, who has gained some kind of lasting reputation, or at least should do. And he is the man who has inspired Pearse. Pearse was looking for people who had left some kind of body of writing or thinking or inspiration behind them, which is why he chose Lalor, because even though Lalor wrote very little, what he did write, Pearse found incredibly inspiring, and that's why he put him into that exclusive pantheon of 4 people whom he invoked as the ghosts. So I would put my emphasis on Lalor the thinker rather than Lalor the doer.
Good, thank you very much, Jim. Do we have any other questions? Anyone else like to participate? Anybody want to raise their hand? Sean, do you want to have another question, Sean?
Well, if nobody else wants to come in, if there's really nobody else, could I just ask you about women, Ireland as a woman? I mean, you talked about, going back to the Gaelic origins, though you also mentioned that Lauder himself doesn't show any great interest in the gay tradition. And the point there is that there's a much more recent tradition of Ireland as a woman in the Jacobite poetry of the 18th century. And of course, there's also the text Lauder might have known, which is Swift's pamphlet on the Scottish Act of Union, The Story of an Injured Lady. But the point about all of those is that the female figure representing Ireland is a maiden in distress, rather than being a powerful conferrer of legitimacy or rights to the land. She is a maiden in distress looking for someone to come and rescue her. In the case of Jacobite poetry, the exiled pretender. So, which is more likely, that Lauder was thinking of the Gaelic or the pagan goddess, or that he was thinking of Jacobite poems from not that far from his own time?
Yeah, it's pure speculation, unfortunately, because the surviving record that we have is pitifully small, and it's even more frustrating when you read about the stuff that might have been preserved and was destroyed one way or the other over the last 170 years or so, and God knows what that might have contained about Lawler's thinking. So what intrigued me most was that when he makes these references in articles and letters, he never in any way explains what he means. He seems to assume that his audience will understand what he's getting at. He simply puts these references in and doesn't go into any detail about who he's referring to, where he sourced these references. He simply makes them, and nobody responds. At least there's no response surviving. No modern day academics have explored this question, have mentioned it. I think a few maybe have mentioned it. When I spoke to one academic person who is an authority on Lauder, and asked her what she thought about this, she assumed that when Lauder referred to the Queen, he was referring to Queen Victoria, which I think is the exact opposite of what he was trying to do. So I have no idea where Lauder got this stuff. The closest I can find is James Clarence Mangan, who was a contemporary of Lauder's and who did produce poems in English, which Lauder must have read in the Nation, which I think were translations or adaptations of earlier poetry in Gaelic. But apart from that, I can only speculate, and I think that's probably all we can do, unless somebody amazing in an attic somewhere. But otherwise, I'm sorry.
Jim, there's no surviving catalogue of the Tinnakill Library, is there? I mean, you mentioned Blackstone's commentaries being carefully read by the young Lauder in his father's house. We don't know what other books would have been there, or what else he might have been reading. Or is that lost to us now?
Yeah, there is a catalogue which his brother compiled. His brother Richard inherited the family farm when the father died. The father outlived James Fintan and died in the 1850s. So I think around 1860, Richard, when he came back from Australia and inherited the farm, compiled a list of books. So what I did was I simply looked at that list, and any books that were there or were dated prior to Fintan Lauder's death, I kind of assumed that he would have read, and there was some evidence in some cases that he knew about France, for instance. There were a number of books on the French Revolution and France in general, both in English and French. But there was nothing along the lines of what you're suggesting about, these early poets or stuff like that, except, as I say, James Clarence Mangan and The Nation, which Lauder read avidly when he could get his hands on it, when his father didn't forbid its entry into the house because it Daniel O'Connell. So no, there's nothing there that I can find which might fill that gap.
Okay, James, do you have another question? James Heaney?
Yeah, I do briefly, Peter. Thanks. If there's time, just on that point, I mean, I suppose it's important to note that, like, when I'm here in Carlow College, in Carlow, obviously, where Lauder studied for a number of years, and he would have studied law here, and the degrees offered by the University of London at the time, and he would have had access to the likes of Blackstone and the like there. But I was wondering, like, is there nowhere where he kind of, a bit like O'Connell did, sort of explores the tension in the British kind of justification for occupation, and the idea of, Blackstone, well, first occupant, you know, whereas of course it's patently obvious to everybody that in an Irish context they weren't the first occupant. So they're on very kind of slippery footing there, and Lauder surely would have understood that, and he doesn't broach that kind of angle at all, does he? Or
well, thanks very much for telling me you're in Carlow College, because Carlow College, as you say, was the only third level or second level institution which Lauder attended. He was only there for less than a year, I think, because he was so sick that he couldn't go to school. He was kept at home, and I think he was essentially self-educated. He went there when he was about 17, but he stayed in bed most of the time, according to one of his classmates that I came across, a guy called Maurice Lenihan, who was editor of the Tipperary Vindicator. And according to Lenihan, Lauder spent his time in bed reading Bolingbroke. He didn't mention any other author. And I'm sure he accessed the library. I'm sure there was a great library there, but that was the only specific reference that Lenihan made whenever he went up to the room to see Lauder. He was reading Bolingbroke. The library in Tinnakill had the 4 volumes of Blackstone's book anyway, so he would have seen that there. His father, having been an MP, I'm sure, had a number of texts which he picked up in London. I don't know, and I'm sure that was one of them. But anyway, Lauder himself said that the only thing that influenced him in his thinking on land was Bolingbroke's, or not Bolingbroke, Blackstone's commentaries. And that particular volume, I think it was volume 2, was the one he referred to specifically. So that's really all I can say. I mean, I've delved pretty carefully into possible sources without straying too far from the record, but that's the only definite one that I can mention.
Okay, Jim, I have a question here from Eddie Malloy, who is having some technical difficulties, but he's emailed me a question to ask, so I hope I get it right. So Eddie's asking, in terms of the idea of implied consent, is there any relation there to John Locke's idea of tacit consent? And is Lauder engaging with Lockean thoughts of Locke's justification of colonialism, or the idea of resistance, in Lauder's idea of moral insurrection articulated during the famine? In other words, is he engaging with Locke's ideas either positively or negatively?
Well, that was one of the things I was eager to find out myself. Was he aware of Locke independently of any references in Blackstone's text or not? And I couldn't really see anything to suggest that Lauder had independently consulted Locke or was aware of Locke or knew Locke's views on all these matters. My own gut feeling is that he came across Locke through Blackstone. Blackstone refers to earlier thinkers and writers like Locke in his distillation of the legal situation governing land. And, it's kind of ambiguous when you read Lauder himself as to whether he's referring to Blackstone's view of Locke or to Locke himself. There's no clear answer to that. My own feeling is that Lauder, in some ways, is so guileless that when he says that he picked up whatever he picked up about land from reading Blackstone, I kind of believe him, unless he came across stuff in Carlow when he was not reading Bolingbroke. But I suspect that his whole formation of thinking on land was guided by something he read, which he instinctively opposed, and that was what Blackstone wrote about implied assent. It seemed to stick in his craw, and he simply developed from that opposition a new philosophy, which happened to coincide with what other people were saying at the time, but I don't think he was aware of that. So it's not a clear answer. I'm sorry, but without entering totally into the realms of speculation, it's probably the best I can say. Okay.
One other question from Eddie. I think one which much less in the field of the realms of speculation, and that is about Lauder's relationship with John Mitchell, who at least partially embraces Lauder's ideas, but with whom he seems to have quite a kind of strained at best relationships. Can you elaborate a little bit on the Mitchell relationship?
Yeah, because this was something I was really interested in, and the more I dug, the more I found. So I spent a great deal of time looking into the relationship between the two men and spelt it out in considerable detail in the book. The short story is that Mitchell and Lauder were quite similar in their thinking, but Lauder essentially was the source of a lot of Mitchell's thinking on land, but that is not terribly clear unless you consult and read very closely the timing and the content of their writings. Lauder ultimately admired Mitchell greatly, but there was a falling out because Mitchell, first of all, wanted to hire Lauder as a contributor to his new paper, and offered him what Lauder regarded as a derisory salary for doing so. So that caused a bit of a rift. But then when Mitchell went ahead with the paper and didn't include Lauder, obviously, in the list of contributors, he simply regurgitated Lauder's own writings, which he had conveyed privately to Mitchell in his letters. And Mitchell simply made them public as if they were his own. And Mitchell admitted this later when he was confronted by Gavin Duffy over his plagiarism, and said, yeah, I did take his writings and call them my own, and so what? I don't think Lalor bore Mitchell any long-term ill will as a result of that, because he clearly admired his courage in the dock and being sent off to into transportation. So, but there was ill feeling between them, and the relationship, such as it was, lasted about a year, I think, and was mainly through correspondence. I don't think they ever actually met. But I think I've tried to demonstrate that Mitchell was the beneficiary of Lawler's thinking, and that may not have been terribly clear at the time to those of whom knew both men.
Okay, Jim, thank you. Time for maybe one last question. If there's anyone who hasn't had an opportunity who wants to, just click the hand button. Or unmute yourself if you want to. Okay, last call. All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim. I think it's well over 30 years. Oh, sorry, we have a question, Hannah. Hannah, do you want to ask a question?
Hi.
Yep.
I put something in the comments. I'm actually from Ohio. I'm at school right now, so at university. So I just wanted to say hello and thank you for sharing today. I really love Irish history and culture, so I really appreciated it. And also, do you think that that Mitchell was like embarrassed to have been taking Culler's ideas? Do you think, like, Lawler's ideas? Do you think that's part of the reason why he plagiarized that rather than, I guess, giving him proper credit?
Thank you, Hannah. Are you in Ohio right now?
Yes, born and raised, but I also go to school here, and I've always wanted to go to Ireland, so I'm hoping that one day I'll be able to.
It's fantastic to be able to talk to someone who's in Ohio. And thank you very much for your question. I saw no evidence whatsoever that Mitchell was in the slightest bit embarrassed by having to admit that he had basically stolen Lawler's ideas and made them his own. So while he admitted that he had plagiarized Lauder in the pages of his own newspaper, which he published, I think, in New York, The Citizen, I think he regarded the ideas as ideas that were not the possession of any individual, and the fact that Lauder had originated them and in his own way communicated them didn't really matter, because Mitchell himself felt he had a greater And he was right in this. He had a greater public profile and could better communicate those ideas than Lauder himself could. Now, having said that, he might have said, well, of course, my former colleague, James Fintan Lauder, is the one who wrote all this. He never mentioned Lauder once in the pages of his newspaper, The United Irishman. So anybody reading that paper would never have thought these ideas originated with James Fintan Lauder. And when James Fintan Lauder then wrote subsequently in the Irish Felon, which was the successor to Mitchell's paper, it must have seemed to people reading both papers that Lauder was actually taking Mitchell's ideas, because if they hadn't read The Nation the year previously, they might have thought that Lauder was actually regurgitating Mitchell rather than the opposite being the case. So it took a while to unravel all of that, but it's all there anyway. If you care to get your hands on a copy of the book over in Ohio.
I'd love to. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Hannah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Hannah. So I think that's probably all we have time for today. So it's been, I think I just started to say there, I think well over 30 years since the last academic study of James Fintan Lauder. So what we've had today is a taste of, I think, a very rich, innovative rethinking of Lauder's ideas and his life by Jim Bruce. So I'd like to thank Jim for spending time speaking to us about that today. If anyone would like a flyer with a kind of discount for Jim's book, just send a message to myself or to Jim, and we'll send that to you. What we might just do is perhaps if everyone would like to very briefly unmute, we can just give Jim a virtual round of applause for Microsoft Teams. So, thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me.
The technology hasn't collapsed, and I think it's been a success. So thank you all very much. We do have a seminar next week, so look out for email or through social media, or look at our website and you'll see the link to that. We'll have Regina E. Colatoyne from UCD Irish speaking on the subject of a new Gaelic league, the global context, same time next week. So hope to see some of you online next week. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.